The spread of socialism in independent Africa. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania adopted socialism as opposed to capitalism as an ideal upon which they based their development of the new and young nations. President Felix Houphouet-Boigny of Ivory Coast adopted the capitalist model instead, but the economic outcomes were generally similar to those of Zambia and Tanzania. While colonial governments left a semblance of some infrastructure, like some roads, clinics, a civil administrative service, and in some cases money in the treasury, much more was needed to cater for the rest of the populations. Kenneth Kaunda's brand of African socialism became known as Humanism. It was a philosophy that identified the significance of man as being central to everything, stressing cooperation among people while condemning exploitation of man by fellow man. Julius Nyerere's brand was known as Ujamaa, a Swahili word defined as familyhood. Nyerere envisioned the unity of the rural village as the nucleus and building block for the whole society. The quest by some of Africa's founding leaders to uplift millions of people from the perpetual doldrums of poverty remains unquestioned, and in the process, some strategic mistakes were made. In some cases, African socialism was tantamount to running a welfare state funded primarily by state-owned enterprises. This model of economic development became unsustainable over time. Governments failed to meet their goals when inherited coffers from colonial authorities ran out. The situation was worsened by rapid population growth. International economic conditions changed, and many state-owned enterprises suffered losses as returns diminished. There were extenuating circumstances, both internally and externally, that led to economic stagnation and failure of some African states in the early 1970s. Prices on commodities like copper plummeted, and the oil crisis of the mid-1970s externally affected the performance of the national economies. In the wake of the Arab-Israeli Yom Kippur War of 1973, crude oil prices increased from $3 in early 1973 to more than $12 in 1974 per barrel. The second oil shock came in 1979 when Iraq went to war with Iran. Crude oil went up from $19 a barrel in 1979 to $38 a barrel in 1981. Oil importing countries, including Zambia, saw their oil imports as a percentage of exports earnings rise from 4.4% in 1970 to 23.2% in 1980. The balance of payments was severely strained, and developing nations were forced to cut on imports of essential commodities and to raise prices on domestic goods. The agricultural sector was hit by higher fuel costs, expensive fertilizer and equipment, and many factories operated on lower levels because of a lack of imported imports. As a result of the international recession of the 1970s, mineral-producing countries like Zambia faced a huge slump in commodity prices, forcing Zambia to produce copper at a loss. These international events began to erode the major economic progress Zambia had attained in the first 10 years of independence, and was now forced to borrow to maintain social programs. For the next 20 years, from 1974 to 1994, copper export prices continued to fall relative to imports like oil. The result was a downward spiral in per capita income to about 50%, making Zambia the 25th poorest country on the poorest countries in the World Index. Internally, in Zambia's case, the copper mines became the main source of funding that government heavily depended on, but lacked any proper reinvestment to keep the mines on the cutting edge. There was very little recapitalization in new machinery, technology, and modern methods of mining. There was also perceived political overreach in the running of the mines. By some modest estimation, Zambia's mines were also overemployed by an average of 3 workers for one job compared to other mining conglomerates like Chile's.